On a frigid December day in 1866, Captain William J. Fetterman led his troops into the teeth of an estimated force of anywhere between 1,000 to 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. These warriors annihilated the captain and his entire command in a short, brutal fashion. Fetterman allegedly once boasted, "Give me 80 men and I could ride through the whole Sioux Nation." He died with exactly 80 men. Who was Captain Fetterman? Was he really the Custer-like, bloodthirsty, arrogant military officer that many people believed him to be? Why were the Lakota so pissed off? And who the hell was Crazy Horse? Find out all this and more on this newest history sure is complicated Massacre edition of Bloody Beaver Podcast. Fort Phil Kearny was established on Friday, July 13th, 1866. Friday the 13th. Already off to a bad start in present-day northern Wyoming, just on the east side of the Bighorn Mountains, as a United States military outpost tasked with the almost impossible goal of protecting American immigrants traveling along the Bozeman Trail. It was the home of 4 companies of the 18th Infantry and commanded by Colonel Henry B. Carrington. Like I said, they were supposed to be protecting travelers along the Bozeman Trail. And the Bozeman Trail was an overland route that connected the Gold Rush territory of Montana to the Oregon Trail. Just one of the many times gold would be discovered on Native American land, thus rendering their treaties void, because we some greedy bitches. During the few years the trail was open to immigrants, about 3,500 people would travel it. American Indian war parties would kill between 40 and 50 of them, and while it was a shortcut, it wasn't an easy ride. The journey usually took around 8 weeks. Drownings and fatal accidents with firearms occurred. Some travelers came down with critical diseases such as mountain fever or Colorado tick fever, and they never made it to their destination. Game including elk, mountain sheep, and bear was shot on occasion, also buffalo. One traveler named Richard Owen wrote, "The men are killing them in large numbers. I feel sorry to see such destruction. They leave tons of good meat every day to be devoured by wolves at night." The travelers grouped in organized wagon trains with chosen people holding posts such as captain, train marshal, and orderly sergeants. Being a route used by single immigrants and small families at first, the trail transformed towards a large supply route with freight wagons carrying equipment and necessities of life to the new western boomtowns. This was land belonging to the Crow tribe, per the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. The land had been recently taken over by the traditional enemies of the Crow, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. They basically went in there in search of buffalo, found a shitload of buffalo, and they stayed. Through their superior numbers, they were able to push the Crow out. And when I talk about the Fetterman fight, you're dealing with all 3 of these tribes, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. But for simplicity, I'm going to focus mainly on the Lakota, also known as the Sioux. Their range was huge, from Nebraska all the way up to North Dakota, eastern portions of Wyoming, and Montana. They were a true Great Plains buffalo tribe, having moved there towards the end of the 18th century, pushing lesser tribes out of the prime buffalo land. If you've ever seen Dances with Wolves, that's the Lakota. The language the actors are speaking is Lakota. Tatonka? Yep, Lakota. There's a good chance when you picture a Native American in your head, your mind's eye is seeing a picture of the iconic Sitting Bull, or another Lakota leader. Red Cloud, who we'll soon discuss, is said to have been the most photographed Native American leader of the 19th century. There are over 128 known photographs featuring Red Cloud. If you have any passing interest in American Western history, then you've probably heard the Battle of Little Bighorn, or the Massacre at Wounded Knee. These were both battles involving the Sioux. They played a huge part in the history of Western expansion from Lewis and Clark all the way up to 1890, and beyond. So here's the situation. You've got Colonel Carrington setting up posts in prime hunting ground the Sioux have now laid claim to, and they're not happy about the military presence. And they're damn sure not happy about all these wagon trains coming through and fucking shit up, senselessly killing buffalo. In their minds, even though they had violently seized the land from another tribe, this was now their land. They earned it through combat, and they'd be damned if they let a bunch of dirty palefaces come in and mess things up. Also, this is only a year or 2 after the Sand Creek Massacre. I talked about that briefly on another podcast episode, I think maybe the one I did on Quanah Parker. But the U.S. Army attacked a friendly band of Cheyenne on Sand Creek in Colorado and slaughtered somewhere between 50 to some estimates bring the number as high as into the hundreds of Native Americans. Most of these killed were women and children. They cut open pregnant women and pulled the babies out of their bellies. They mutilated dead children, just horrible, horrible atrocities. And these atrocities would be fresh on the minds of the Sioux as well as their Cheyenne companions. And they did what primitive people have always done. They took to the warpath. If the whites wouldn't get the hell out of their land and leave the buffalo alone, they'd make an example out of them. And this would kick off what was known as Red Cloud's War, also called the Powder River War or the Bozeman War. This war would consist mostly of small-scale Indian raids and attacks on the soldiers and civilians at the 3 forts in the Powder River country, wearing down those garrisons and finally culminating in the Fetterman fight, which is what we're going to discuss today. So yeah, gold got discovered, a shortcut to the gold mines cut straight through the heart of Sioux hunting ground. The Sioux retaliated, and now here comes the army in the form of Colonel Carrington to defend the trail from warring natives. Sound impossible? Yeah, it kind of was. So let's talk about Colonel Carrington. Who was he? Carrington was an educated man, the epitome of an officer and a gentleman. Born in Connecticut in 1824, he was a Yale graduate and professor at the Irving Institute in New York, teaching both Greek and natural science. He studied and practiced law and became a staunch anti-slavery Whig and helped form the Republican Party in the 1850s. So not the type of guy you'd really imagine commanding a lonely frontier outpost in the heart of Indian Territory. So how'd that happen? I don't know. Civil War, I guess. At 38 years of age, Carrington was commissioned as an officer in the Union Army. He wasn't really involved in fighting, though. He did help organize thousands of troops, and then he would investigate secret organizations such as the Knights of the Golden Circle that harbored deserters. In March 1863, Carrington was promoted to brigadier general and made commander of the District of Indiana of the Department of the Ohio, later renamed the Northern Department. He was basically an intelligence officer, like the Civil War version of a CIA officer. He had a network of spies, he collected intel, and collected evidence that would lead to the prosecution of dissidents. And then he, for whatever reason, stayed in the military after the war and was assigned as commander of the Mountain District Department of the Missouri in 1866. Then he got assigned to protect the Bozeman Trail, where he built and personally manned the remote Fort Phil Kearny during Red Cloud's War. And the rest is history. So who's this Red Cloud feller I keep talking about? Chief Red Cloud was a member of the Oglala Band of Lakota, and he was roughly the same age as Carrington. Wikipedia, that bastion of fucking truth, lists his birth year as 1822. Red Cloud was an old school Lakota. He learned the ways of a warrior at a young age. He went on many raids as a young man against the traditional enemies, the Crow, the Pawnee, and Blackfeet. By the time the war named after him and the Fetterman fight took place, he was in his mid-40s, a seasoned war chief and tactician. According to Lakota physician Dr. Charles Eastman, Red Cloud once said, quote, "Hear ye Dakotas. When the great father of Washington sent us his chief soldier to ask for a path through our hunting grounds, a way for his iron road to the mountains and the western sea, we were told that they wished merely to pass through our country, not to tarry amongst us, but to seek for gold in the far west. Our old chiefs thought to show their friendship and goodwill when they allowed this dangerous snake in our midst. They promised to protect the wayfarers. Yet before the ashes of the council fire are cold, the great father is building his forts amongst us. You have heard the sound of the white soldier's axe upon the little piney. His presence here is an insult and a threat. It is an insult to the spirits of our ancestors. Are we then to give up their sacred graves to be plowed for corn? Dakotas, I am for war." So yeah, he was pissed. And so were all of the Sioux. By the way, he just used the word Dakota, and I've been using the word Lakota. There were three main factions of the Sioux: the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. These names are sometimes used interchangeably. Charles Eastman himself was a Dakota, and Red Cloud was a Lakota. And also, I highly doubt Red Cloud was talking in hear ye form. This is a translation. The gist of it is clear, though. Fuck these cracker motherfuckers. We're going to war. Going to the mattresses. A week later, they struck Fort Phil Kearny. Crazy Horse, a young and upcoming war chief among the Lakota, would lead the fight on the ground, while Red Cloud and the older chiefs would work as counselors. And what I'm about to say is going to sound like some bullshit I make up, but it's not. Right before the Fetterman fight would take place, right before the battle, Red Cloud called for the Lakota's most powerful half-man, a hermaphrodite who was believed to have special powers, to give advice from the butte overlooking the proposed ambush site. The, quote, half-man rode on his pony in a crazed manner 4 times before the warriors gathered on the butte and Lodge Trail Ridge, each time gathering more soldiers into his hands in a prophetic manner. When he returned to Red Cloud the 4th time, he declared that in his vision he had 100 blue-coat soldiers in each hand, too many to hold. So there you go. The half-man hermaphrodite prophesied that they would win. And they would win. Big time. By the way, believe it or not, gay or trans people were not looked down upon in Native American culture. Rather than emphasizing the homosexuality of these persons, many Native Americans focused on what they considered to be their spiritual gifts. And to them, since everything that exists is thought to come from the spirit world, androgynous or transgender persons are seen as being doubly blessed, having both the spirit of a man and the spirit of a woman. Thus, they are honored for having 2 spirits and are seen as more spiritually gifted than the typical masculine male or feminine female. Anyway, so ever since Fetterman built Fort Kearny, they've been dogged by the Sioux. There have been a total of 50 attacks so far, with Carrington losing a total of 20 soldiers and 2 civilians. You can go online and see videos of where the fort was located. It's a beautiful setting, actually. Rolling grass-covered hills, snow-capped mountains to the west, and no trees. The men of the fort would actually have to form woodcutting groups to travel miles away to get lumber for building the fort, and then later on for fuel for the winter. And the fort was pretty big and consisted of a log wall 8 feet tall, and enclosed an area of 17 acres, which included company and officer quarters, a chapel, a battery, a sutler's building, a cavalry yard, as well as a bunch of other buildings. And I keep mentioning civilians. In addition to the 400 soldiers stationed at the fort, there were about 150 civilians. These included the men on the wood detail, just hired laborers, people wintering at the fort, as well as specialized jobs like a storekeeper, a blacksmith, etc. And also the wives and children of some of the soldiers. Yeah, there were women and children at Fort Phil Kearny. There's no way in hell I would have brought any loved ones with me to Wyoming in 1866, but they did. So speaking of Crazy Horse, this was a true badass, a real warrior's warrior. He was born somewhere around 1840, 1842. He refused to have his picture taken, so we have no visual records of him, but he was said to have had lighter colored hair, and he never wore war paint or feather headdresses, or anything like that. He was straight up fighting machine. No pomp or flair was needed. Personality-wise, he was said to have been extremely shy, always helping out the poor and needy of his tribe, but at the same time always holding himself aloof. Black Elk once said this about Crazy Horse. Quote, he was a queer man and would go about the village without noticing people or saying anything. In his own teepee, he would joke, and when he was out on the warpath with a small party, he would joke to make the warriors feel good. But around the village, he hardly ever noticed anybody except little children. All the Lakotas liked to dance and sing, but he never joined a dance, and they say nobody ever heard him sing. But everybody liked him, and they would do anything he wanted or go anywhere he said. He was also what was known as a shirt wearer. A shirt wearer was the name given to one of the highest formal honors amongst the Lakota people. Shirt wearers were expected to have a level and quality of emotional and spiritual maturity or character development to which not everybody aspires. It was an honor bestowed on warriors who had emotionally and spiritually developed to a point where they could exercise forethought, wisdom, and control over their behavior. They were expected not to be petty and rise above personal matters, and if they did not, or if they did anything to harm the tribe, they were stripped of their shirt wearer role, as was the case for Chief Crazy Horse. He remained a shirt wearer until 1870 when a dispute arose after a Lakota woman named Black Buffalo Woman left her husband for Crazy Horse. The woman's husband ended up shooting Crazy Horse in the face with a pistol, leaving a horrible scar and costing him his position as shirt wearer. Black Buffalo Woman, huh? Oh yeah, looks like Crazy Horse was dibble-dabbling in that swirl, if you know what I mean. Okay, so we've established the Sioux leadership, who they are, why they are taking up arms. We've looked at Fort Phil Kearny and John B. Carrington, the officer in charge. But we haven't talked about William J. Fetterman, the man who the fight's named after. He wasn't with the initial group that rode with Carrington to first start building the fort, but he would show up with reinforcements later on, just 7 weeks before the Fetterman fight would take place. And by this time, Colonel Carrington was starting to acquire a bad reputation. Instead of going on the offensive, he was mainly focused on the defense of the fort. And I think he was in a rush to get the fort completed. It was already wintertime, and he had a lot on his plate. His soldiers not only had to go out and protect the many civilian wood details, but he had to keep enough men at the fort to defend it if it was attacked. All this as well as somehow trying to protect the civilian travelers foolish enough to cross the Bozeman Trail. Nevertheless, Carrington was starting to be considered a coward by some. I mentioned earlier that during the Civil War he had not participated in any combat. That alone was enough to make some of the men in his command lose respect for him. So it was into this environment that William Judd Fetterman rode, along with reinforcements, and unlike Carrington, Fetterman was a much celebrated hero of the Civil War. For his wartime exploits in Georgia, 31-year-old Fetterman had been breveted lieutenant colonel. He believed in himself and in traditional military strategies. The enemy who ran away was a coward, and the commander who took defensive positions was weak. He's always came off to me, when I've read about the fight in the past, as just a cocky, sort of George Custer-like officer. Someone who didn't respect his enemy enough, thinking the army could just ride roughshod over all the American Indians. He's actually rumored to have said at one point, "Give me 80 men and I'll ride straight through the Sioux Nation." He and the other newcomers, along with Lieutenant George Washington Grumman, pushed for Carrington to seize the offensive, stop playing games, and take the fight to the Sioux. Carrington not only felt pressure from his own officers, but from his boss, General Cook. Cook not only wanted Carrington to strike the Indians in their own camps, but also threatened a general court-martial over reports that were missing due to a delayed mail delivery. So yeah, tensions are high. The fact that there was a strong faction against Carrington is evident in a letter Fetterman wrote to a Dr. Charles Terry on November 26, 1866. He wrote, quote, "We are afflicted with an incompetent commanding officer, Carrington, but shall be relieved of him in the reorganization. He is going to the 18th, and we are becoming the 27th Infantry." On the morning of December 6th, a wood train was attacked, and the lookouts on Pilot Hill signaled the fort. Carrington sent Captain Fetterman, Lieutenant Bingham, and about 30 cavalrymen to relieve the train and drive the Indians north across Big Piney Creek. Carrington, bowing down to pressure, led Lieutenant Grumman and about 25 mounted infantrymen out from the fort as well, intending to circle around Lodge Trail and kind of cut off the retreating Sioux in Pinot Valley. And things did go as planned, at first, at least. Fetterman took the cavalrymen straight to the wood train, forced the attacking Indians to withdraw, and drove the attackers towards Carrington and the mounted infantrymen. But Carrington and Grumman had not yet arrived at Pinot Creek. Bingham's cavalry had got spread out during the pursuit, and then many of the men panicked when the Indians turned on them. I forgot to mention, most of these soldiers at Fort Phil Kearny were young green recruits. Experienced fighting men like Fetterman were the exception, not the rule. Bingham galloped off for some reason, either to rally his troops or to chase a few warriors who were actually being used as decoys. In any case, the officer was soon cut off from Fetterman and the soldiers and shot full of arrows. Carrington became engaged in a separate skirmish north of Lodge Trail Ridge before finally meeting Fetterman on the Bozeman Trail in the Pinot Valley. Grumman, like Bingham, had apparently gone his own way during the battle, but he was able to return in one piece after allegedly slashing his way through the Sioux with his saber. Only Bingham and one other soldier died in the December 6 action. 5 soldiers were wounded, and as you can see, what started off as a well-executed engagement quickly turned into a chaotic shit show. And this would only encourage the American Indians. Years later, some of them were recorded as saying that the December 6 skirmish had convinced them that they could overpower and destroy any force sent out from the fort. It may also have convinced them that the decoy tactic, nothing new and not usually effective against experienced soldiers, just might work at Fort Phil Kearny. Colonel Carrington had also learned a valuable lesson from the narrow escape. He sensed that the original attack against the wood train had been a decoy, and to avoid ambushes in the future, he gave orders that his men were not to chase after fleeing Sioux war parties. Man, this tactic has been around forever, and people still fall for it even now in modern day times. The Lakota tried the old decoy trick again on December 19th, attacking a wood train, and when a relief force headed by Captain Powell rode out from the fort, they withdrew, hoping to lure the soldiers into an ambush on the other side of Lodge Trail Ridge. Powell, however, followed orders and did not pursue the attackers beyond the ridge. The warriors shrugged off this failure and tried once more just 2 days later. And this is around the time that the half-man hermaphrodite had the vision of 100 dead soldiers. So the Sioux were definitely worked up. They were excited. They were ready to get their game on. On December 21st, 1866, a wood train left the fort at 10 a.m. and was attacked by a decoy party less than an hour later. At first, Carrington again gave Captain Powell command of the relief detail, but when Captain Fetterman claimed seniority based on his brevet rank, Carrington relented and allowed Fetterman to assume leadership. And remember how Fetterman supposedly had once boasted that if given 80 men, he could ride through the Sioux Nation? Well, on this day, the captain got his 80 men. 49 infantrymen on foot and Lieutenant Grumman and 27 cavalrymen, Post-Quartermaster Captain Frederick H. Brown, and 2 civilians. 2 days earlier, Powell had shown restraint and avoided casualties. But on the 21st, Fetterman was in command and said to be eager to fight, which played right into the hands of the Sioux. Grumman still wanted to fight too, even though he had almost been killed on the 6th and had a new bride back at the fort waiting on him. And nobody wanted to fight more than Brown, who actually delayed a transfer east because he wanted to personally take care of and scalp Chief Red Cloud. Little did they know that on the other side of Lodge Trail Ridge waited some 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, under the leadership of young Crazy Horse. Supposedly, witnesses later testified that Carrington had commanded Fetterman not to pursue the Indians across the ridge. His orders were to support the wood train, relieve it, and report back to the fort. Do not pursue the Indians. Under no circumstances pursue over Lodge Trail Ridge. He apparently had repeated these orders 3 times, wanting his intent to be crystal clear. Instead of advancing directly along the wood road to relieve the train, Fetterman led his force behind the Sullivan Hills, perhaps intending to cross over the hills and attack the raiders from the rear. Whether or not that was his intent, it never happened. Lakota scouts observed his movements and then notified the decoy party that was attacking the train. The raiders then withdrew from the wood train, which would make it back to the fort safely, and went up Lodge Trail Ridge. Decoys standing along the crest of the ridge yelled and gestured to the soldiers. Fetterman and his infantrymen headed for the ridge. Grumman and the cavalrymen caught up with Fetterman, and the whole command followed the Bozeman Trail up Lodge Trail Ridge, the ridge they were explicitly ordered not to cross. Once on the ridgetop, they saw only a handful of Indians below, near Pinot Creek. And one of them may have been Crazy Horse, on foot pretending to have a lame horse just in an attempt to entice the soldiers down into the Indians' trap. It was about noon, and the command was some 4 miles from the fort. Whether Fetterman gave the order or Grumman was acting on his own will never be known. But the cavalrymen charged down the slope ahead of the foot soldiers, who then followed. Carrington's order had been disobeyed, and a heavy price was about to get paid. And just as they reached the Pinot Valley, the huge mass of warriors rose from the high grass. Arrows flew, along with some bullets, as the ambushers unleashed their wrath. Grumman was probably one of the first to die. He reportedly went down swinging his saber and may have even severed the head off of a warrior. The 2 civilians, James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher, as well as a few troopers, dismounted and formed an effective rearguard action, at least for a little while. Most of the cavalrymen tried to retreat back towards the infantry, then dismounted and made a stand. Fetterman and the foot soldiers, unable to advance or retreat to the fort, they were completely surrounded at this point, so retreating was not an option. All they could do was form a defensive circle farther up the slope. That meant that now there were 3 small, separate groups of soldiers trying to hold off a vastly superior force that had shot an estimated 40,000 arrows during the fight. Wheatley and Fisher had 16-shot Henry repeating rifles, those damn Yankee guns you load once on Sunday and shoot all week, and thus were better armed than the soldiers. The cavalrymen had 7-shot Spencer repeating carbines, but the foot soldiers had to make their last stand with their obsolete 1-shot Springfield muzzleloaders. The soldiers below probably all died first as they were completely exposed. Most likely in the last stage of the fight, Fetterman and his infantrymen fired from their tight little circle near the top of the slope, where the rocks provided a little bit of cover, until their ammunition ran out. Lakota warriors would later state they had moved in so close that some of the arrows they unleashed struck their fellow warriors on the other side of the circle. In the end, the warriors rushed right up to the soldiers, slashing at them with their war clubs, lances, and knives. Before the final assault, Fetterman and Brown possibly shot each other in the temple to avoid capture and slower, more painful deaths. Their bodies, according to some accounts, were found lying next to each other with powder burns on their heads. If that's true, I almost don't want to say this, because I've never been in combat. But I kind of want to say that the two shooting each other in the head to avoid torture was a pretty cowardly thing to do. And that's not even because I believe that suicide is the coward's way out. I don't. The only reason I say that is because they were the leaders. Good, bad, or indifferent, their young, inexperienced troopers looked to these veteran officers for leadership. How frightening it must have been to be a young private, brand new to the military, and witnessing your 2 commanding officers kill themselves, and realizing that you now had 0 hope of surviving. In the annals of Wyoming, however, John McDermott argues that Fetterman died another way. The assistant surgeon Samuel M. Horton, who examined the bodies before burial, told a special commission that Fetterman's throat had been cut crosswise with a knife. A Lakota warrior named American Horse, a cousin of Red Cloud, later confirmed it, saying that he personally had knocked the officer from his horse with a war club and finished him with a knife. In any case, Fetterman and all 80 men of his command were dead. The Fetterman fight had lasted only about 40 minutes. The Native Americans removed their dead from the battlefield whenever they could, so it's not known exactly how many casualties they suffered, but at least 60 warriors probably died in the battlefield, and many others may have died later on from their wounds. In fact, Fetterman's men killed more Indians on December 21st, 1866, according to one Cheyenne warrior's estimate, than Custer's men did a decade later at the Battle of Little Bighorn. After the Fetterman fight, the warriors stuck around for a victory celebration, during which they scalped and mutilated the dead soldiers. Ears, noses, fingers, hands, tallywhackers, and other body parts were severed. Eyes were gouged out, brains were bashed in, guts ripped from the bodies and placed on rocks. They wanted to make sure these soldiers, their enemies, would be completely helpless in the spirit world. There was only one soldier whose body lay unmolested, Bugler Adolf Metzger. And I think when we think of Army buglers, we think of the little, bugler boy, or at least I do, like some fresh-faced 16-year-old kid, not old enough to fight, but old enough to play the bugle. That's not the case here. Metzger was a seasoned veteran. The German immigrant had enlisted in the Army 11 years earlier in 1855. He had seen service in the Southwest, then throughout the Civil War, even participated in the bloody Battle of Gettysburg. He was a fighting man, and that cold December day in 1866, he proved it. While Fetterman and Brown may or may not have committed double suicide, many of the soldiers would die crying and begging for their lives, out of ammo. But not Metzger. When he ran out of ammo and the Sioux rushed in to finish him off, he started swinging that bugle like a club, bashing in the heads of his attackers. He cracked so many skulls that by the time he finally went down, that bugle was just a mass of twisted, bloody brass. And the Sioux, instead of butchering him, cut a simple cross on his chest to indicate that he had died bravely, facing the enemy, and then they covered his body in a buffalo robe as if he was sleeping. His heroism had aroused the admiration of the savages. Finn Burnett, a civilian at the post, said later, they covered his corpse with a buffalo robe as a symbol of extreme respect. I get goosebumps thinking about it. What a badass motherfucker. I pray that when my time comes, I can stand it like a man, like Adolf Metzger did. So one cool thing about doing this podcast is that I'm forced to do research and do some fact checking. I don't want to just be spouting off half-truths and tall tales. This means finding out that some things I considered a fact never really happened. I talked about this on my John Wesley Hardin episode. I always thought that he had really killed a man for snoring, but when I looked into it, it turned out to be a myth. Another good example was the drawing of the line in the dirt at the Alamo. When Travis laid it all out, last chance for anybody to leave, all those who will stay with me and fight to the death cross this line. And everybody crossed, including Jim Bowie, who had them carry him over on his sickbed across the line. Yeah, it never happened. So that said, did Adolf Metzger really die swinging that bugle? Was his body really left unmolested by the Sioux? Long story short, I don't know. I just mentioned how civilian Finn Burnett claimed that his body was unmolested and covered with a robe. Also, there's the verbal accounts of warriors who survived the battle that claim Metzger fought to the bitter end. Then there's the case of the bugle. Right now, on display at the Jim Gatchell Memorial Museum in Buffalo, Wyoming, is a tattered, bent-all-to-hell bugle said to be Metzger's. The bugle wasn't taken off the field when the bodies of the dead were retrieved, but would later be found in 1935 by early homesteader Christian Hepp, who ran cattle near the grounds of the ruins of the fort. Since Metzger was the only bugler in the expedition, some people think this bugle is his. You could do a search for a Metzger's bugle, Gatchell Museum, and you'll see a picture of it. Pretty cool looking. Historian John H. Monette, however, maintains that the story of Metzger and the bugle is apocryphal. In his very detailed book, where 100 soldiers were killed, which I have not yet read, he supposedly makes a very strong case. Apocryphal, for any of you dummies like me who don't understand big complicated words, means a story or a statement of doubtful authenticity, although widely circulated as being true. Even just the story of the bugle is hard to verify, because another account I read just a week or so ago stated that Metzger's body was dragged off by the warriors and never found. Unfortunately, I can't find that article again. I gotta start bookmarking this shit. There is a Find a Grave memorial online for Private Adolf Metzger that lists his final resting place at Section B, Row 3, Grave 11 at the Custer National Cemetery in Montana, so I'm pretty sure his body was recovered. And by the way, the men killed in the Fetterman fight were initially buried at Fort Phil Kearny, later on exhumed and reburied in the Custer Cemetery, where the remains of Custer soldiers were also laid to rest. So did Metzger really go down fighting to the end, swinging that bugle and crushing skulls? We'll probably never know. It's a cool-ass story though, one that I'll continue to tell, apocryphal or not. Back at the fort, and after hearing gunfire coming from behind Lodge Trail Ridge, Carrington sent out a relief party, headed by Captain Tenador Ten Ike, to assist Fetterman. But by the time Ten Ike was on the crest of the ridge, some 3 miles from the fort, the shooting was already over. He saw the huge mass of warriors in the valley below, and they saw him. The warriors began to mock the soldiers, daring them to come down and fight. But Ten Ike knew better than to leave his position. He waited until they had left before he finally ventured down towards the massacre site. The relief party took 49 of the mutilated bodies back to the fort that night. The situation at Fort Phil Kearny became more tense than ever. The fighting force had been reduced by 1/3, and they had to assume that an emboldened Sioux would surely strike again. As soon as he verified the news about Fetterman, Captain Carrington sent word to Fort Laramie, some 240 miles away, with civilian John Portuguese Phillips, who had volunteered to carry the colonel's message. The next day, Carrington wanted to send a detail out to recover the rest of the bodies, and some of the officers complained. They felt that sending out a small party would not be safe for the men who went, and while sending out a large party would leave the fort too exposed. If we can't rescue our dead, as the Indians always do, at whatever risk, Carrington argued, then how can you send details out for any purpose? And he was right. We still have that no man left behind policy today. At very least, you know that if you fall in combat, your remains will be taken care of. And if you're cut off and horribly injured behind enemy lines, every effort will be made to save you. Carrington led the detail himself, showing some real leadership here. He could have easily ordered one of his junior officers to head the detail, but no. He knew he had to show courage in the face of danger. Their recovery went smoothly, but after the bodies were brought back to the fort, a blizzard struck, and their garrison's fear of attack grew with the snowfall, which piled nearly as high as the walls of the stockade. Remember Phillips, who volunteered to travel to Fort Laramie to spread the bad news? Well, despite the sub-zero temperatures and a blizzard, he made it. The next day, General Cook got word in Omaha, Nebraska, and Cook put the blame for the military disaster squarely on Carrington's shoulders. He replaced Carrington as commander of Fort Phil Kearny with Fort Reno's Lieutenant Colonel Henry W. Wessels. And now Fort Phil Kearny finally received more men, ammunition, and all the other supplies, all the shit that Carrington had been asking for all along. So yeah, the fallout was pretty huge for this blunder. Military leadership was being held accountable, and Carrington would get the initial brunt of it, as well as his reputation being dragged through the mud. The newspapers at the time mainly blamed Carrington for the Fetterman massacre while portraying Fetterman as a victim, and that view helped shape public opinion on the disaster. Fetterman would actually have a fort named after him the following year. And to show just how inaccurate the reporting on the massacre was, and to let you know that fake news is not a recent phenomenon, one newspaper asserted that the fight took place at the gates of the fort, with victims knocking and screaming for help while those inside looked on, afraid to fire or to open up the gates. Margaret Carrington, the colonel's wife, complained about newspaper articles written by actual observers or special correspondents who could not possibly have been on the scene. As there was no one to contradict and no one who knew the truth, a large margin was left for the play of the fancy, she wrote. The American people, of course, were greatly shocked by the tragedy, and they needed a scapegoat. And within the War Department, Carrington made a very handy scapegoat. He would find some redemption when a presidentially appointed commission under the Interior Department made its report on July 8, 1867. The commission confirmed that several times Carrington had repeated his order that Fetterman's relief party not give chase over Lodge Trail Ridge. The report concluded that the commanding officer of the district was furnished no more troopers or supplies for this state of war than had been provided and furnished him for a state of profound peace. Basically, he was undermanned. After retiring from the service in December 15, 1870, not quite 4 years after the Fetterman fight, Carrington devoted at least some of his time to clearing his tarnished reputation. His wife Margaret wrote the book Absaroka, Home of the Crows in 1868, but died just a few years later. Carrington remarried in 1871. His second wife was Frances Grumman, the widow of Lieutenant George Washington Grumman. She too helped him clean up his image, stating that it was indeed Fetterman being a hothead that caused the massacre and that Carrington did everything he could to avoid such a disaster. And after the Fetterman massacre, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho would continue to fight. They harassed and attacked both Fort Phil Kearny and Fort C.F. Smith. They were driven off by soldiers at both the Wagon Box fight and the Hayfield fight in August of 1867, but they were accomplishing their goal. Only heavily armed military trains could move on the Bozeman Trail. No immigrants or civilians would even dare to do it. The next year, Washington officials ordered the 3 forts guarding the Bozeman Trail to be abandoned. By early August 1868, the last soldiers had left Fort Phil Kearny and Fort C.F. Smith, and the Indians had burned them both to the ground. Red Cloud would finally sign a peace treaty on November 6 at Fort Laramie, thus ending the Red Cloud War. In the Fort Laramie Treaty, the government conceded that the Powder River Country was an unceded Indian territory and that whites could not pass through without the Indians' consent. Not that it really mattered, though. As I discussed in a previous episode, there's nothing that could have stopped the white man from seeking riches in the goldfields. This is exactly what happened with the gold mining town of Deadwood in the Black Hills. Where there's gold, the white man will face any danger and break any treaty to get their hands on it. But still, on paper, this was the only time a Native American tribe won a war against the United States, however short-lived that victory would be. As a matter of fact, they would only have a few short years left as a free warrior people. 10 years after the Fetterman fight, there'd be another massacre, this time in present-day Montana near the Little Bighorn River. George Armstrong Custer led the 7th Cavalry straight into the jaws of death, resulting in the complete annihilation of 5 of his companies of soldiers. And once again, Crazy Horse played a key part in this battle, leading from the front. Waterman, an Arapaho warrior who participated in the battle, said Crazy Horse, quote, was the bravest man I ever saw. He rode closest to the soldiers, yelling to the warriors. All the soldiers were shooting at him, but he was never hit. Another battle participant, a Lakota by the name of Little Soldier, said, quote, the greatest fighter in the whole battle was Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse is said to have exhorted his warriors before the fight with Hoka Hey, today is a good day to die. The Battle of the Little Bighorn had far-reaching consequences for the natives, however. It was the beginning of the end of the Indian Wars. It was their last stand. Within 48 hours of the battle, the large encampment on the Little Bighorn broke up into smaller groups just because there wasn't enough game and not enough grass to sustain a large congregation of people and horses. Soon the army would come in force and put immense pressure on the bands, not to mention the fact that it was just getting harder and harder to find the ever-dwindling buffalo herds. On January 8, 1877, Crazy Horse and his warriors fought their last major battle at Wolf Mountain against the U.S. Cavalry. His people struggled through the winter, weakened by hunger and cold weather. And then finally, Crazy Horse decided to surrender with his band, just to protect them, doing so at Fort Robinson in Nebraska. For the next 4 months, Crazy Horse would reside in his village near the Red Cloud Agency, and the attention that Crazy Horse had received from the Army drew a lot of jealousy from Red Cloud, remember him? And Spotted Tail, 2 Lakota who long before came to the agencies and adopted the white ways. Rumors of Crazy Horse's desire to slip away and return to the old ways of life started to spread at the Red Cloud and Spotted Tail agencies, and these rumors led to the arrest of Crazy Horse. While being escorted under guard on September of 1877, Crazy Horse allegedly pulled 2 knives out of concealment and attempted to escape. He was then bayoneted to death. He was around 35 years old. Red Cloud, who I just mentioned, never fought again after the Fetterman fight. He settled with his band and became a reservation Indian in 1873, not participating in the Great Sioux War or the Battle of Little Bighorn. Outliving all other major Lakota leaders of the Indian Wars, Red Cloud died on Pine Ridge Reservation in 1909 at the age of 87, and was buried there in the cemetery now bearing his name. In old age, he is quoted as saying, "They made us many promises, more than I can remember, but they kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it." Colonel Carrington lived to be an old man as well, dying in 1912 at the age of 88, but not before continuing to try to clear his name, having penned another book with his second wife called My Army Life and the Fort Phil Kearny Massacre, where the blame for the disaster is once again put squarely on the shoulders of Fetterman. And I've been aware of this Fetterman fight for years. I've read a lot of stuff about it, but like many of the topics I cover, this was the first time I did like a deep dive. And for any actual academic types or historians listening, which I doubt there's any, but I know it's got to infuriate you when I say I took a deep dive. I know. I don't have citations. I'm not researching any dusty old books at the library. I'm an amateur. So my definition of a deep dive is much different than yours. But yeah, I did look a little more deeply into the matter than I had previously. And I've always believed the narrative story that foolhardy Fetterman had defied orders and led his men to death, that he was at fault. But that might not actually be the case. After the initial blowback on Carrington and the bad press he got, most of the legend of the battle was shaped by two women who accompanied the soldiers to the fort, the first and second wives of Colonel Carrington, both of whom wrote books that I already mentioned that were published in an attempt to exonerate their husband from accusations that his inept leadership was the underlying cause of the catastrophe. We already talked about how the atmosphere at the fort was rife with insubordination towards Carrington due to the fact that he wasn't taking offensive measures. But by the time Fetterman arrived, the officers were actually well aware of the military superiority of the Sioux and appreciated the precariousness of their situation. Carrington even authorized Fetterman to attempt a few offensive tactics during the first days at the post. Within just a few weeks, Fetterman had been involved in half a dozen deadly skirmishes. And he actually acknowledged, quote, "This Indian war has become a hand-to-hand fight, requiring the utmost caution." Yet somehow the story that evolved portrays Fetterman as openly contemptuous of Carrington, a hothead, and desperate to prove his superiority in battle, proclaiming, quote, "Give me 80 men and I could ride through the whole Sioux Nation." Did he really say that? What a fine coincidence it is that he died with 80 men. I find it highly suspect whether or not he actually uttered that phrase. And if you look at Fetterman's military career as a whole, it greatly contradicts the idea that he was just some sort of a cocky glory seeker or unprofessional soldier. Huh? What's that, Rufus? No. I said cocky glory seeker, not glory hole cock seeker. What the fuck's wrong with you lately? No, I won't double check. I know what I said. Get out of here. I'm trying to do a podcast. Sorry about that. Where was I? Oh yeah, so by the way, Fetterman and Carrington were not strangers prior to being stationed together at Fort Phil Kearny. Fetterman actually served under Carrington during the Civil War. And as a matter of fact, through the entirety of the Civil War, Fetterman served with distinction, rising through the ranks to acting assistant adjutant general of 9 regiments, more than 10,000 men, and was ultimately breveted lieutenant colonel for great gallantry and good conduct. Once at Fort Phil Kearny, Fetterman realized his troops in his command were raw recruits, and they had just spent the previous months not as soldiers, but as construction crew for the fort. He immediately started training them and drilling them, trying to get them combat ready. On the day of the massacre, these green recruits had only been involved in just one other relief mission. Unlike Fetterman, Lieutenant Grumman did have a history of recklessness on his military record, as well as insubordination in a series of violent, drunken incidents that culminated with him being court-martialed and publicly reprimanded. Just 2 weeks prior, he, Grumman, had brazenly disobeyed Carrington's direct orders and led 4 soldiers directly into a trap that cost the lives of 2 of his men, clearly inspiring the ambush tactic that the Indians would execute so well on December 21st. And remember, Fetterman was leading a troop of infantrymen on the relief party. Infantry or foot soldiers. Grumman was leading cavalrymen, or horse soldiers. They would have been able to move much, much faster than Fetterman's infantry. J.W. Vaughn did an analysis of the battle site, published in 1966, that proved it would have been impossible for Fetterman, with his marching infantrymen, in the time that it had elapsed, to cover the distance between the fort and the spot 1.5 miles beyond the ridge where the dismounted soldiers were first attacked. Oral evidence from American Indian participants substantiates this assertion, thus concluding that it's highly likely that the reason he went beyond the ridge and out of sight of the fort was to attempt to support the men on horseback, not because he was irrationally desperate for glory. So who the fuck knows, man? Was Fetterman a hothead glory seeker? The only evidence of this is Carrington's testimony and that of both of Carrington's wives. His professional career and quick rise to the military ranks suggest he was nothing short of a model soldier and officer. Did he brashly ignore orders and march his men to the death, or was he marching his men in to try to save Grumman, and then just quickly outnumbered and overwhelmed? If you know the answer, please let me know, because I sure as hell don't. And did Fetterman and Brown commit joint suicide, opting for the easy way out instead of being hacked to death or possibly even taken alive and tortured? I don't know. I don't know shit, really. I don't even know why y'all are listening to this, to be honest. At least one Lakota warrior did make the claim that he killed Fetterman, although a lot of sources I've read do concede that Brown may have shot himself in the head. If you're a fan of Old West history, you've probably heard the whole save the last bullet for yourself idea. And Native American torture techniques were frighteningly brutal. I mean, imagine being tied up and slowly skinned alive, passing in and out of consciousness as your skin is removed from your body, not in small strips, but in just one whole piece. Finally passing out and laying on the ground as your lifeblood slowly seeps out of you. Or being placed over a fire and slow roasted. This is some of the stuff that actually happened. I've covered on previous episodes the fate of women that are captured by war parties, beaten and subjected to brutal gang rapes before finally becoming a slave, if not killed. So it's no wonder you wouldn't want to be taken alive. It's no wonder so many people said that you should save that last bullet for yourself. I don't know if Brown and Fetterman saved the last bullet, but I do know that many men before them did. And I also know that the plans at Fort Phil Kearny, were it to be overran, was to pack all the women and children in the fort's battery room and blow it up. They'd rather have their loved ones die a quick death than fall into the hands of the Lakota. Kind of makes me think of that Stephen King movie, The Mist. Spoiler alert. I'm going to ruin the ending, so you might want to skip ahead a few minutes if you haven't already seen it. At the end of the movie, the main guy has escaped with his young son and a few other survivors. They're driving through the mist, which is full of some sort of weird, like, killer insect creatures, and their car runs out of gas. They were hoping to drive through the mist to safety, but no such luck. Knowing that their only fate now is being painfully and horribly ripped apart by these weird alien creatures, the father takes out a pistol, places it to his sleeping son's head, and pulls the trigger. He then kills the other passengers as well, saving them from the pain that surely awaited them. The father lets loose a guttural scream of mourning, places the revolver in his mouth, and pulls the trigger multiple times. Click, click, click. He's out of bullets. He opens the car door, steps outside, and leans against the vehicle, yelling for the creatures to come on and finish him off. At that moment, the mist starts to slowly fade, and a military convoy drives up. The father collapses to his knees, knowing that if he had just waited a few minutes, they would have been saved and his son would still be alive. And I guess that about wraps this episode up. I have no idea what my next topic is going to be on, so it'll be a surprise for both of us. Hope you enjoyed this episode and the ramblings of a madman, and please go over to iTunes and give me a review and a rating if you haven't already. I hope if you ever find yourself in combat, you don't ever fall for that decoy trick. And if you're going through a tough time, don't be like that dude from The Mist. Be like Private Metzger and keep on fighting. Don't ever give up. As long as your heart's pumping and your lungs are taking in air, there's always hope. Always a chance. Whatever circumstance life throws at you, just keep on fighting. Like the old saying goes, if you're going through hell, keep on moving. You might just make it to the other side. And if not, you can go under at least knowing that you gave it your all.